Welcome to the NNJR Trackside Classroom on YouTube. My name's Bill Gilbert, and I'm one of the NNJR chief instructors, and happy to today be talking about braking, and specifically tracks braking as it applies to student drivers. Now, there's a lot of sort of myths associated or misconceptions associated with braking on track, which I'm sure some of you have heard, particularly things like, you know, how important it is to brake late and brake super hard. Well, there is some truth in that, but only if you're a pro driver. So today I want to focus on the basics because the basics are um, in for beginner drivers especially uh, pretty hard to master simply because they are the opposite of what we do on track. So today we'll talk about proper braking technique and some sort of, well, let's call them advanced or things that those of you in yellow and blue can certainly work on as well. So with all that said, let's dive in. The normal disclaimer that we're sharing here our best advice, but you use it at your own, with your own judgment and at your own risk. So here's what we plan to talk about today. Briefly talk about the learning sequence or how one learns a corner. Um, then we'll break down the steps in a corner, and then we'll zoom in on the braking part, including some examples at Lime Rock and at Watkins Glen, and then we'll wrap it up. Now let's start with how all of us, each of us, whether you're a pro or a brand new beginner, has to learn each corner. And the beginning step and the most basic one is the line. And if you're a new driver, your instructor is going to help you with that. The second priority is exiting the corner safely and quickly. And to do that, we have to find where we can first put our foot on the gas, which is called the throttle application point, and then where we can get our foot on the floor, called wide open throttle or sometimes watt. Um, and we have to find those points before we can get to point three, which is braking and entering the turn. And when we're focused on that, we're focused on a smooth transition from getting from the straightaway all the way to that throttle application point. And that's why the step two comes before step three. And I didn't make this stuff up. This is straight from the Going Faster book, which is the Bible from the Skip Barber racing school. So let's take several steps backward and talk about the basics of braking. Uh, and this may seem unnecessary, but I find many drivers, beginning drivers especially, are not seated properly in the car. So we have to be seated so that our right leg has plenty of bend in it, even when our foot is on the floor with the gas pedal or when we're pressing hard on the brake pedal. If that knee isn't still bent in those positions, then you're not going to have proper control and you're certainly going to be tired with that leg. Our right heel should stay on the floor. It should pivot between the gas pedal and the brake pedal. You shouldn't have to move your whole foot. We simply want to swing that foot. And if you're not doing that, then obviously that's a first step to practice. And then we want, as a beginner or even maybe a yellow or blue student, we want to have a consistent point where we begin braking. And I highlight that because you're probably, as a student driver, going to be approaching that brake point at different speeds depending on how well you did the previous corner or perhaps traffic in between. And using a consistent breaking point and learning to adjust using that same point is an important step in your learning process. And if you do have a car with a manual transmission, it's hard for us to teach you heel and toe on the track. You need to practice that and learn that on the street. So, as a next step, what are those corner entry steps? We're now going to zoom into, the that step three in the original outline here. And if we break it down, we're going to lift our foot off the gas pedal onto the brake. Actually, that's not correct. We're going to pivot our foot from the gas pedal to the brake pedal. And we're going to do that as quickly and smoothly as we can. Then we're going to press on the brakes to slow the car down in a straight line. And by the way, that's where 90% of the slowing or more should happen, in a straight line. And then in most corners, we're going to continue braking at a very light level as we turn in. And then some point after we turn in, we're going to come off the brakes and get back on the gas. And that seems easy, but that point of coming off the brakes is called brake release. And as you see in the quote from Ross Bentley, that is where the magic happens. So if you're an advanced student, that's something you should pay a lot of attention to, and imagine your instructors may have already pointed that out to you. So let's look at some examples. So here's Watkins Glen turn one. This is a heavy braking zone. So in this example, we've decided we're going to begin braking at 400, meaning we have had our foot on the floor to this point. So we're just now pivoting, lifting the toes up or the ball of the foot up off of the gas pedal and swinging it over to the brake pedal. That means we should be hard on the brakes by the time we're a little bit further down the track, say at 300 in this example. So now we're just hard on the brakes, slowing the car down. As we get to the turn-in point, though, we're going to come off of that heavy brake because the car now needs to be able to turn, of course. And as we get perhaps halfway to the apex, we're going to come off the brakes completely, the so-called end of braking or EOB. Now, let's talk about a hard braking zone. If this top line where it says wheels with lock is maximum braking, here's an example of getting on the brakes smoothly and then coming off very quickly, almost jumping off. Here's a different example where we get on the brakes immediately as hard as possible, stay on them, and then come off again very abruptly. Well, neither of those is what we want. This is what we want. But this is where braking on the track is the opposite of what we do on the street. Because we want to get on the brakes quickly but smoothly, but we want to come off in a much more gradual fashion. And how steep that slope is coming off and so on is going to vary, but the shape should look something like that in virtually every corner. So, what are some common braking mistakes? If you're a beginner, an inconsistent point where you get on the brakes, inconsistent amount of brake pressure, jumping on and off the brake pedal is very common. Also, mimicking what we do on the street, where we get on the brakes at the right point, but we only get on them softly, maybe at 40%. And then we realize we're approaching the corner and we need to slow down a lot more. So now we get on more brake. Well, that's the opposite of the graph you saw on the previous page. For more advanced students, we still see too little pressure early and too much late. Not as dramatic, perhaps, as a green student, but it still happens. And a very common mistake is going from heavy brake to heavy gas. In other words, we're into the corner, we've gone in on a fair amount of brakes. We kind of go quickly from that brake right onto the gas pedal. And that obviously upsets the car. And we see people trying to brake late. And most of us aren't ready to brake late in the yellow and blue run group because if we do that, we put a lot of stress on how smoothly we can come off the brakes and exactly how much we can slow down. We end up with inconsistent entry speeds and inconsistent amount of braking. And the net effect is you end up not being able to exit the corner smoothly. So let's look at a couple of tracks. Let's talk about Lime Rock and what that means for braking. There are no slow corners at Lime Rock, but there are high speeds. But really only one heavy brake zone, and that's turn one. Um, and that is a classic trail braking corner, meaning um, the first half of Big Bend, turn one, is followed by a tighter corner, which means we can't accelerate. So we're going to extend the front straight by braking as long as possible. That's what we mean by a long trail in turn one. And we have somewhat the same situation in the left-hander where we're trying to set up turn four, the right-hander, and therefore we can carry a lot of brake into the left-hander. Elevation, like all tracks, helps and hurts braking, and the turn names give it away, right? The uphill is uphill, and that certainly helps our braking. The downhill, the reverse, right? Pretty obvious. And interestingly enough, for a short track, Lime Rock has three fast, count them, three fast corners. The uphill, west bend, and downhill are all very quick. And what that means for braking is the opposite of turn one and the left-hander. We do not want to do trail braking. We want to do 99% of our braking in a straight line. And we want to do that not with a dramatic brake, but with a gentle brake, which means it might start sooner than we think, but be very gentle and come off gently because we're trying to maintain the balance of the car so that we can get through those fast corners. Let's talk about Watkins Glen. We can tell a similar story. Again, there's no slow corners. Um, I've sometimes called Lime Rock half of Watkins Glen for that reason. But in any case, there aren't any slow corners. There are high speeds, and that results in two really heavy brake zones, especially turn one. But the bus stop is also a heavy brake zone. Um, we have a number of corners where we can trail in some amount of distance. Each one varies, of course, but um, turn 6, 8, 9, and the bus stop all reward a fair amount of trail brake. Again, we have elevation that helps and hurts. We have turn 6 downhill followed by an uphill in turn 7. And we have fast corners, turns 10 and 11, just like I described for Lime Rock, very little trail brake and do it in the same gentle fashion. So to help think about how we use the brakes, I ask you to think about brake pressure on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is no brake, 10 is you're in the ABS, or you've locked up the wheels in an older car. Where for maximum braking, we want to be at kind of 9.5, just before the wheels lock up. But that's how we should think about how hard we're pressing on the brake pedal. And for those really heavy brake zones, like that Watkins Glen turn one that I showed you, same thing at VIR turn one, and to a lesser extent at Lime Rock, we want to get on the brakes and use them. We want to get to that 9 or even 9.5, in the early part of the brake zone. But look what happens as we get further into the brake zone. Yes, we stay at that hard brake, but now we begin to lessen the amount of brake pressure, uh, for two reasons. One, we want a smooth trail off, but secondly, as we slow down, we don't need as much brake pressure. The same amount of brake pressure will lock up the tire, or activate the ABS. So the car naturally wants us to do this anyway. And at some point, depending exactly on the corner, at two or three or somewhere in that range, maybe between one and two, we're going to turn in. Now, fast corners look very different. Here we're talking about, Watkins Glen or VIR turns 10, the uphill, downhill, and West Bend at Lime Rock. Here we want to start braking at probably a three or something like that. And we want to just do a slow, gentle trail off. So by the time we're turning in, we're barely on the brakes at all. Maybe we're not on the brakes at all whatsoever. Depends a bit on the car, but you get the idea. And not much at all by the time we get to turn in. Now, as you get better, here's, those of you in blue and advanced yellow, you know, focus on your end of braking. Am I coming off? It's much more important than the start of braking, because we can always um, break a few feet earlier and modulate to get to the same end of breaking point, which is why it's such a critical reference point. And you want to be aware of not only where that point is, but how you're coming off the brake at that point, and focus on making that consistent. And one way to help with that is to be aware of your brake pressure, your amount of brake pressure at turn in, and make sure that's consistent. If it's a 2.5, make sure it's 2.5, lap after lap. If you're a beginner, you can ignore this slide, other than as something that you can strive for down the road. Now, here's a heavy braking example to kind of show you a real world example of what this means. Uh, and here we've got real brake pressure now. This is a brake pressure trace from my car, and shows you, exactly how much brake I was using. In this example, same slide I used earlier, you know, I'm not on the brakes yet here. I'm just moving my foot from the gas pedal, swinging it over to the brake pedal at the 400 mark in this example. By the time I'm at 350, now I'm on the brakes and I'm ramping up the pressure. By the time I'm at 300, I'm on full maximum brake pressure. And notice that brake pressure holds pretty pretty high for a while. In fact, you're going to see it stays up there until almost the 100 mark in this example. And then it begins to taper off, because by the time we get to turn in, we can't be braking that much or the car won't turn, right? And now at turn in, now my brake pressure has dropped a lot. I've come off the brakes, and as the more I turn in, the more I'm going to come off, to the point where halfway to the apex, there's no brake pressure. So that's what it looks like in the real world, in a very heavy brake zone. Here's what it looks like at Lime Rock for turn one. Um, you know, uh, I come off my gas pedal at the 5 and start to move my foot, but guess what? There's no brake pressure because we aren't on the brakes yet. I didn't put it in here, but in this particular trace that I happened to grab, this point here is about 4.5 where I begin to get on the brakes. And I didn't do a very good job of getting on them. I kind of pussyfooted around here for, too long, rather than just going, straight to more brake pressure. But notice there's a peak here, and at Lime Rock, in this example, it was from about 3.5 to about 2 on the brake boards, and then began to trail off. And I said earlier, we're extending the front straight into turn one. So we're going to expect to see a long trail off. So here's the one marker. Um, and now, the brake pressure is well off. But guess what? The end of braking doesn't happen until abreast of the first apex. And in fact, that can be improved if you're really good at it. As a beginner, this would be very good, but you know, I should be doing better than that. My end of braking should in fact be further up, because we're trying again to extend the front straight. But I hope the shape of the brake trace here gives you an idea of how to think about this kind of a long trail type corner, which is somewhat different than what you saw in the turn one Watkins Glen example, where we have a more classic corner with a short amount of trail brake versus this one with the long amount. So to summarize, if you're a beginner, got to focus on that track braking technique. Make sure the seating position is solid, the heel pivot. Get used to that hard initial brake with a gentle release. That's the basics of the most essential basic of braking on the track. And it helps mentally some people to think about doing most of your braking in the first third of the brake zone, because there's actually some amount of truth in that, because so much braking happens in a straight line when we get on the brakes hard that it makes the rest of the brake zone easy. When we do the reverse, when we don't use enough brake, and now we've carried speed later, now we make the rest of the corner and the rest of the brake zone harder. So we really want to use that first part of the brake zone to really slow the car down. Yeah, as you get more experience, you can think about the amount of trail braking. And of course, as we've discussed, it varies a lot depending on the corner, and it's affected by elevation, corner length, all kinds of things. And as you get better, you can focus on that end of braking. You can work on that smooth transition off the brake and onto the gas. The goal here is that if I were to ride with you, I couldn't tell when you came off the brake and got on the gas pedal. That's what you should strive to do. And you can practice that on the street. You can practice coming off the brake smoothly as you slow down for a corner or an entrance ramp, or even as you come up to a stop sign. You can practice coming to a stop in such a way that the nose of the car doesn't even pop up. There are ways to train that right foot to get it much more sensitive to how it comes off the brake pedal. And I strongly encourage you to pay a lot of attention to that in your day-to-day street driving. That'll make you, that'll get you a big step forward when you get to the track. So as usual, if you have any questions, I'm happy to talk to you at the track. I'm also happy to answer questions via email. And I hope you found today's session useful. And the tips here are some that you can apply the next time you go to the track. I look forward to seeing you at your next track event, whatever that may be. Mine happens to be Lime Rock, followed by Watkins Glen. But I look forward to seeing you there, and I wish you a great day.